Why did the man we know as Edgar Allan Poe so rarely ever use that name? He was born Edgar Poe. His father, David Poe Jr. and mother, Eliza Poe, had both had acting careers of some notoriety. But his father abandoned the family shortly after Edgar's birth, struggling with alcoholism after his career took a downward turn. Then, when he was just 2, Poe's mother died of tuberculosis. Poe wasn't old enough to ever have known his parents. After his mother's death, Poe was split up from his brother and his sister and taken in alone by John Allan and Frances Allan, who lived in Richmond, Virginia, where his mother had been performing before she'd fallen ill and died. John and Frances couldn't have children of their own, and the desire for a child, Frances's connection with Eliza Poe, and a sense of communal charity prompted them to become foster parents to Poe. Frances was a fond mother, but Poe's relationship with John Allan was more fraught, and the Allans never formally adopted Edgar. Growing up, Poe wasn't socially isolated. Most of his school friends would later write of him as being popular, intelligent, athletic, and a willing leader in pursuits of fun. He also made friends during his short stay at the University of Virginia, and then when he joined the army and on to West Point. Yet there were others who described him as reserved, and Poe himself resonated with the Byronic image of a romantic poet with a troubled upbringing, a lone figure in the universe. Of course, his outward popularity doesn't necessarily guarantee that he felt connected with those around him. He styled himself as a solitary figure, with literary, poetic interests that not many shared, as he stood outside from the rest of the world. When Poe was 20, then a sergeant major staying at Fort Monroe, his foster mother Frances Allan died. He'd been writing home to John Allan, inquiring about her health, but often with little or no response. When he eventually learned the severity of the situation, he rushed home, but arrived too late. The funeral had taken place the day before. 5 years later, John Allan also died, and though a wealthy merchant, he'd disowned Poe and left him nothing. Later in life, Poe wrote, "I have many occasional dealings with adversity, but the want of parental affection has been the heaviest of my trials." Poe avoided the name Allan, cutting it down to just a single character. From childhood's hour, I have not been as others were. I have not seen as others saw. I could not bring my passions from a common spring. From the same source I have not taken my sorrow. I could not awaken my heart to joy at the same tone. And all I loved alone. Then, in my childhood, in the dawn of a most stormy life, was drawn from every depth of good and ill the mystery which binds me still. From the torrent or the fountain, from the red cliff of the mountain, from the sun that round me rolled in its autumn tint of gold, from the lightning in the sky as it passed me flying by, from the thunder and the storm and the cloud that took the form when the rest of heaven was blue, of a demon in my view. That was Alone. Let's go through it and check we understand what it means. So in the first 8 lines, Poe is quite simply explaining how he feels. The language is simple with little ornament. It's just a raw description of feeling separate from the rest of the world. He talks of how the things that mean a lot to him don't seem to matter much to others. Even the things that lead to sorrow, whether that's the things that bring him sadness but no one else seems to care about, or whether it's the things that everyone else seems to get moved by, but he feels distant to. Even sorrow extends his loneliness. And so both joy and pain bring alienation, isolation. And so it's more than just a practical isolation, a loneliness that can be fixed with a change in circumstances. It's a whole difference of feeling, of soul, that's dividing him from others, a problem more intractable. And the depth in the poem here comes from Poe's choice to articulate this precise feeling. There's really not that much to analyse in terms of language, imagery, symbolism. He does talk of a common spring, a source of sorrow, both references to water and to origins, reflecting how emotions flow fluidly and naturally like water, born from some central place. But the way his emotions flow and the way the emotions of others flow aren't the same, from the origin and all the way through. But on top of the natural flow of emotion like water, there's also an element of action to it. His passions are something to bring from a common spring. Sorrow needs to be taken from a source, so doing, the will, is part of it, but still there's an overriding sense that this isolation is just how things are for him. It's not really a choice. Even with the element of action inherent to it, it's beyond him to just will himself to fit in and feel as others do. Then comes probably the defining line of the poem, "And all I loved alone," which I think is a great line. It may seem simple, but it's very hard to write a line that's so succinct and yet so memorable and so powerful. It's so straightforward that there's really not much to say about it, other than the fact that normally, if you found something you love, that's a good thing. Your life is full and rich, but Poe shows a nuance. Having love in the sense of having passions does bring richness to life, but it'll struggle to make you fully happy unless you have people to share those passions with. The next line after that starts, "Then," i.e. back then in his childhood, emphasising the importance of that time. It's italicised. That's when the problem started, and it's then, his childhood, that's been weighing on him so heavily all his life, giving birth to the mystery that even now he can't solve. There is another possible meaning to the word then, which can mean next or afterwards, which could make it feel like a shift is happening in the poem. The problem's been described, all he loved alone, but then something's going to happen. Yet the whole point is that there isn't a change, it's just more of the same mystery. However, if there is a shift, then it might be a shift in age from when he was a child and then as someone older. Of course, young children are always asking why for explanations, justifications of things happening around them, but children often see things very much from their own perspective and from their own interest. If something happens they don't like, they'll see themselves as a subject to that pain. They're unlikely to reflect on whether their own faults are the cause of that suffering. They ask why, but without self-reflection or a deep understanding of life. At some point, maybe in adolescence, maybe sooner, we develop that thinking, and someone who feels alone might start asking themselves what's wrong with them, in a way that a young child wouldn't. And it's interesting that the mystery is drawn from good and ill. Again, that's another example of the whole spectrum of feeling bringing up that same problem. The loneliness and the mystery of the loneliness is all-encompassing, but also it potentially introduces value judgments into his self-reflection. Is his loneliness evidence that he's unique, someone who will stand out from the crowd? Or is it down to some major fault in his personality? Or does good and ill hint at his attitude towards others, sometimes wanting to have goodwill towards people, but other times resenting them? The final 10 lines of the poem are quite a strange response to what's gone before. The poem started with such clear language, but now we get this stream of imagery without a clearly explained meaning. But these images are repeatedly introduced with the word from, so Poe's telling us that the mystery is coming from them all, each image of nature birthing this constant mystery. In the same way that he first made us realise his loneliness was more than a product of practical circumstance, but rather a matter of his whole way of feeling, his whole experience, so now, still as an adult, the problem keeps emanating from everything around him, his whole experience, and he sees it, experiences it everywhere. The assortment of images he presents us with, I feel, does a number of things. Firstly, the images include differences in perspective that demonstrate the separation between his view and other people's perspectives, and the alienation that follows from that. Most noticeably at the end, when he talks about a cloud in an otherwise blue sky, that to him seems like a demon dominating his view, whilst others would be enjoying the clear heavens. Also, at the start of these 10 lines, we have the torrent or the fountain. Both examples of flowing water, but where the torrent might suggest dangerous, violent waters, whilst the fountain might be a source of drinking water, a source of life, something life-giving, or at least something elegant and refined. So maybe these two images are just two different perspectives of the same thing. Secondly, the variety of the images represents the contrasts and the opposites that can be found in nature, from the rushing water to the stolid cliff face, the golden sunshine to the thunderstorm. And that in itself is something of a mystery, because it may leave you wondering how and why such opposites can exist in the same world. So the strange, competing forces of nature represent the mystery he's wrestling with. But in truth, I'm not 100% sure exactly what these last 10 lines are supposed to mean. And maybe that's the point. Poe has set up the problem as being the mystery of this loneliness, but the response to that is just nature, images of the world, things as they are, no answer, because the world doesn't come with explanations. Things just are. You may want to know the meaning, but we're just faced with the being of things. The why is absent, and so the mystery goes on. So as you've already seen, this is how the poem is written out on the page. It's one solid block of 22 lines of text. And it won't come as any surprise to you that this is a rhyming poem. It's written entirely in rhyming couplets. And for now, that's all I'm going to say about the rhyme. I'm going to move straight on to talking about the metre. So this is how to mark out the metre line by line. The slashes represent stressed syllables and the X's represent unstressed syllables. If I now regularise the spacing, what you'll see is that the slashes and the X's broadly line up, creating a metre, a pulse throughout the poem, from where the stresses regularly fall. However, what you will notice, and how I've notated this, is that there is some nuance and variation to the pattern of stressed and unstressed syllables. So here I'm using a capital X to denote where a syllable that's not on the pulse is actually receiving stress, whereas I'm using a backward slash to denote where a weak syllable is landing where a strong pulse would be expected. So for example, in the line, "My passion's from a common spring," the metre would suggest that the word "from" is one of the stressed syllables. My passion's from a common spring. My passion's from a common spring. But of course that's not the most natural way of reading that line. The word "from" is usually weakened to just "from." My passion's from a common spring. Yet in metric analysis we'd still be generous and say that a pulse is felt there, even though the word "from" is not truly stressed. Because of the fact that throughout the whole poem, each line has 4 pulses, 4 positions of stress in it, we would call this tetrameter. You may have heard of pentameter before, where there'd be 5 stresses per line, but tetrameter is 4 stresses per line. Now the particular pattern of stressed and unstressed syllables reveals that this poem is written in iambic tetrameter or iambic tetrameter, because it goes da-dum, 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 with each line generally containing 8 syllables for the 4 stressed pulses. However, you can see on the right-hand side that the pattern is a bit different. For the top 2 lines, the pattern between stressed and unstressed syllables is clearly flipped around, so instead of da-dum, 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 it's da-dum, 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 from the torrent or the fountain. This reverse pattern has its own technical name, and that would be called trochaic tetrameter. Now the rest of that right-hand side is a bit ambiguous because most of the lines have only 7 syllables, so it's not entirely obvious whether it's iambic or trochaic. You could certainly make a strong case that this whole poem is written in iambic tetrameter, but just with some variation in it. However, the final 10 lines do represent something of a change of rhythm. It feels like there's a shift in the momentum. So the fact that on the right-hand side, the first syllable of each line falls on the pulse, that could encourage us to say that these final lines are in trochaic tetrameter, whereas everything beforehand was in iambic tetrameter. If this is what we go with, then this could give us a clue as to what Poe was thinking of when he was writing this poem. His plan was to write the whole thing in tetrameter, largely iambic tetrameter, but with a noticeable shift in the pulse for the final 10 lines. And of course he was writing in rhyming couplets throughout. And for me that pretty much covers what you need to know in order to understand how Poe wrote this poem. When writing a poem, it is a challenge to focus on the content of what you're trying to get across, also picking the right imagery to fully express your meaning, whilst also including these aesthetic characteristics that are satisfying to have in poetry. That's a lot to hold in your head at once. So keeping the aesthetic framework fairly simple helps you to write poetry because you can focus most of your energy on the content whilst only having to meet a small set of aesthetic criteria. And so that's why all of the analysis up till now has been about how I think the poem was written. The analysis of the poem as written. While a poet may be writing to a simple aesthetic framework, as they write, more complex patterns can emerge within the poem, very often accidentally, although this can become deliberate in certain cases. And these more complex patterns are things we can potentially pick up on as we hear a poem. So now I'm going to analyse the poem as heard, moving on from what I think Poe was concentrating on when he was writing the poem. And the first step in this would be to note that even though the poem is written as one block of text, I think it actually divides itself into 3 sections. I think we have an initial section of 8 lines which takes us up to the word alone. Then we have the word then, which marks the beginning of a group of 4 lines, which takes us into this concept of mystery. This then sets us up for the final 10 lines, where there's this rhythmic shift that I've been talking about. So though it's written in one continuous block, I think it's heard quite naturally as 3 sections. Now let's shift our focus to the rhyme. As is obvious, it's written in rhyming couplets, and the rhyming words are all at the end of a line, as is the norm. However, Poe repeatedly uses enjambment, so even though the rhyming words are at the end of the line, as it's written on the page, actually a number of these rhyming words appear in the middle of a clause. So for example, I have not been as others were. That's a clause that runs across 2 lines, and the rhyming word sits in the middle of it. It says, I have not been as others were. I have not seen as others saw. I could not bring my passions from a common spring. Now that's a clause that runs across 1.5 lines, where the word bring within that clause rhymes with the word spring that comes at the end of that same clause. And these different clauses are helpfully separated by long dashes, as you can see on the page. So sometimes the rhyming word does occur at the end of a clause, matching with the end of a line, but sometimes the rhyming words are within clauses, with no pause really intended before carrying on to the next line. Therefore, the way the rhyme interacts with the flow of the words and the pauses sounds more complex than actually a rhyme occurring at the end of each line. So if I rearrange the poem to reflect better how we hear it, it might look something like this, with some rhymes feeling like they're occurring in the middle of a line and some rhymes clearly at the end. Now this isn't the only possible way of laying it out. I've just tried to maintain the same number of lines for each section. And for me this poem inspires a different way of doing rhyme, different from having the rhyme always at the end of a line, and different also I feel to the concept of internal rhyme, which to me is a bit more like sprinkling in some additional rhymes into the middle of lines rather than focusing on putting the main rhyme in the middle of a line. So when you have the clauses, I have not been as others were, I have not seen as others saw, the rhyme, the main rhyme, is occurring on some axis partway through the line rather than being at the end. Because why does the main rhyme always have to go at the end? And why is internal rhyme always just a sprinkling of additional rhymes here and there throughout a poem? Why can't you have axis rhymes, where the axis of the rhyming words is something different from the end? And there are multiple places where Poe has done this very noticeably in this poem, but also then shifting between the axis rhyme and the typical rhyme at the end. So removing the colours now, this is what I think could be a reasonable representation of the poem on the page, more akin to how it's actually heard. And for comparison, let's just switch back to how it's actually written. But here's a better reflection of how it's heard. So that's how the rhyme actually sounds within the context of the poem. Now I'm going to move on to doing the rhythmic analysis. So previously, when considering how it was written, we talked about the metre, But now when talking about how it's heard, I'm going to focus on rhythm, which is more specific than meter. Meter is about a general framework of stressed and unstressed syllables, a layout of pulses, but rhythm is about more precise patterns. So I'm going to start off by adding back in the metric notation that we had before. It's hard to recognise when it's laid out in this new shape, but it is the same slashes and X's that we had before. And I'm going to regularise the spacing to make it easier to take in. Whereas in metric analysis we had to consider these nuances of unstressed syllables that occur on the pulse, and therefore they subconsciously feel like they're carrying a bit of stress, even if the speaker isn't actually stressing those words much at all. When we're looking for the precise patterns in the rhythm, we don't necessarily need to take that concept into account. Where we've got what would naturally be unstressed syllables, we can write them as unstressed syllables. So let's substitute a whole bunch of X's in there where I think they'd naturally go. Also, if we want, we can introduce the idea of relative stress. I have not been as others were. I have not been. The been is probably stronger than the have. I have not been. So let's repurpose some of our previous notation and use a capital X for syllables that are partly stressed but not strongly stressed. Now that we've modified our notation to more precisely reflect how the words might actually be read, the task now is to pick out recurring patterns in the rhythm. So I've highlighted a few different ones here. So in the yellow we have a number of phrases that I feel have a very similar rhythm. From childhood's hour, I have not been, as others were, I have not seen, I could not bring, and all I loved. In the blue we have a number of phrases in a slightly different rhythm. From the torrent, or the fountain, from the lightning, from the thunder of a demon. And then in the white, another rhythm. Good and ill, binds me still, round me rolled, flying by, took the form. And obviously these repeating rhythmic patterns throughout the poem give the poem its music. It's got similar rhythms recurring, but it's got variation, it's got overlap. And these rhythms I've picked out here don't cover everything. They don't appreciate the full nuance. They haven't included the fact that slightly different rhythms can yet sound similar to other rhythmic patterns, and therefore create still more rhythmic connections within the poem. So this isn't comprehensive, and a full rhythmic analysis is usually not possible because it just gets too much. So the point of a rhythmic analysis is just to go some way to aiding your understanding of what's happening in the poem and why it sounds as good as it does. The principal takeaway being that recurring rhythmic patterns give the poem its music, and this is a key part of how we hear poems. Part of the reason I chose to analyse this poem is because I feel its structure could define a new category of poem, one that I call the travail. There are already various different categories of poem. There are sonnets, there are villanelles, there are sestinas, and some others, but there aren't really that many, or at least there aren't many well-known ones. Now, I'm a strong believer that poetry can be in whatever form you want it to be. You don't have to stick to a template. But I think that when there are these templates, these categories of poem, they provide a tradition that when you choose to, you can buy into. And when you buy into the tradition of a sonnet or the tradition of a villanelle, your individual poem becomes part of a discourse. When you choose to write a poem in a particular form, you're saying this poem is an example of a sonnet or a villanelle or whatever it may be. And then all of the culture, all of the connotations of that type of poem, all of the other examples of poems written in that particular form, then are slightly felt within your poem, and your poem in turn helps shape what the form means as being a new part of that tradition. That's one reason why, even though poems can be anything, it's nice to have these pre-existing forms that can be reused and reused to extend a tradition with more and more examples of poetry. And one of these could be a travail, and alone could be an example to copy and create a new tradition out of. So a travail, as with alone, would be a poem of 22 lines, split into 3 sections, likely of 8 lines, 4 lines, and 10 lines. The theme of a travail would be about a problem. If you're writing a travail, you're writing a poem about a problem and what flows from that problem. The first section would be very much about setting out the problem. This could be a problem that you as the writer are struggling with or have struggled with in the past. It could be about someone else's problem. The whole poem might be written for someone else, or the problem could be something a bit more abstract. And this first section might be very clear, like in Poe's one, or you could be more abstract, metaphorical, obtuse, whatever you want to be. Skipping forward, the final section would be some kind of outcome, some kind of response, potentially an answer. As with Alone, the outcome might be no answer at all, but you could do it in various ways. Are you still stuck in the middle of the problem? Can you not see a way out? Might you be fantasizing about what it would feel like to be free of this problem, even though you aren't there yet? Or maybe it's something you have overcome and you're telling the story of how you overcame it. The middle section is more of a bridging section. It starts moving us from the first section and sets up the last section. If you want another example of a travail in existing poetry, then I might suggest The Second Coming by W.B. Yeats. The way it's written out, there's already a break after the first 8 lines, where this first section is representing the problem of a world that has lost the uniting and guiding force of religion. Then, just over 4 lines later, we hit the phrase, troubles my sight, followed by a colon, which sets us up for what could be a third section, describing an image of the unknown beast that is coming in place of religion. So if we put a split in there, we get 3 sections for the poem, with this new middle section bridging the gap between the initial problem and the envisaged outcome. I've also had a first attempt at writing my own, called Labour, which is shown here and which I've also made a video for. The link to that's in the description. I'd find it exciting to see other people start writing travails, exploring the form and building this into a tradition. But wherever you choose to take it, be true to the spirit of the form. If you try to be too individualistic and deviate too far from that blueprint, you will corrupt the whole point of the form, for yourself and for everyone else. Too many changes will mean there won't be a recognisable form at all, and so there won't be the shared symbolism, understanding of what this type of poem represents. When using any set form, experiment, but be humble. This may be a new tradition I'm suggesting we start, but it could become a tradition if you want to take it up and you handle it with respect. And a travail should in some way be a poem about troubles of 22 lines delivered in 3 sections. I'd like to feel that I have more heritage to connect with, but if people always want the liberty to push things in whatever individualistic direction they choose, that tramples over everything that might otherwise be shared in common, and we won't have heritage. In time, I will try to write more travails myself, and hopefully you'll try to write some too. Maybe you'll let me know how you get along and share what you come up with. And then, maybe, by sharing our travails with each other, we might feel less alone.